I'm John Ricker. I'm the County Water Resources Division Director and also on the steering team, executive team for this groundwater management effort for Mid-County Basin. Briefly tonight, we are going to update folks on where we're at in planning for the Mid-County Basin. We had a meeting here almost a year ago to solicit membership of our advisory committee, and we've been doing a fair amount of work since then. So we want to report back and provide an indication of where we're at, answer any questions that you folks might have, and then about the last half of the program, we're going to break into small discussion groups that are focusing on particular topics. So we do want to answer your questions. We also want to ask you about things you'd like to hear at the next meeting that we have, so that we get a sense of how often and when to have these stakeholder meetings. But first, let me just do a few introductions. We have a number of staff folks here, and we also have members of our board and our advisory committee. So, board members, raise your hands. Right. Advisory committee members, raise your hands. Okay, and then staff folks. All right. How many folks are private well owners that are here? Okay. Oh, I am too. How many folks are on a small water system or operate a small water system? All right, good cross section. And how many folks are from outside of our basin, the Mid-County Basin? All three. Okay. All right, well, we got a good group, small group, but hopefully we'll move right along. So I already covered what the agenda will be. What is the Mid-County Groundwater Basin? We have 3 groundwater basins in Santa Cruz County that are designated as priority. Wrong button. What do I do with that? There we go. I guess that's not the pointer. Anyway, the Mid-County Basin is the one here that's circled. Goes all the way, here's roughly where the harbor is sort of the western edge, and it includes Bransford Creek, comes up along here. Right around here is Olive Springs Court, if you know where that is, coming along the Zayante Fault, and then down along the east side of Central Water District, and includes the La Selva Beach area. So it's Mid-County. This is the Pajaro Valley Basin. That's another basin that's subject to groundwater management under the state's program. And then also the Santa Margarita Basin up here, which includes Scotts Valley and parts of the San Lorenzo Valley. These are all designated as priority basins that require groundwater management under the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act.
What's the purple, John?
The purple, okay, these are some other, the state sort of went through and designated basins without really checking with us locally, so they call this Purisima Highlands, and they call this green one over here West Santa Cruz Terrace. As far as we're concerned, those are not really basins. Basins, I mean, they do have some groundwater, but they don't have a large, massive groundwater. That water in these areas is sort of few and far between, and there's not a lot of pumping in those basins. Those have been designated with a very low priority, so they're not required to be any management. But if we had our druthers, those probably wouldn't even be on the map as basins, but that's just something that happened years ago with the state process. And now we have to come up with all sorts of technical information to take them out, so we're just sort of leaving them alone at this point. So in terms of the challenges facing the Mid-County Basin, the big ones are lower groundwater levels. Our groundwater levels over the years have been depleted and are below safe levels. That's caused seawater intrusion into parts of the basin and threatened seawater intrusion into the other parts of the basin. If the groundwater levels are too low, the seawater can come in. And we've also seen reduced stream flow in Soquel Creek and other streams that normally would be fed by the groundwater, but because the groundwater levels have been reduced, there's not as much water coming into the streams for the fish and for the other sorts of things. So our basin is designated as being in a state of critical overdraft. So is the Pajaro Valley Basin is also in critical overdraft, as well as many basins in the Central Valley. Santa Margarita Basin to our northwest is not in critical overdraft. And the Soquel Creek Water District has been in a stage 3 groundwater emergency for a number of years already, with keeping their pumping levels and their water use down. So those are the main concerns. And I should say what we're going to do is myself and John Kennedy are going to give sort of an overview of what's going on. We'll pause to answer questions that you might have, and then we'll go into the small groups. So, groundwater management efforts. We've actually been at this now for a number of years. The water agencies have been working together to try to address these challenges. Soquel and Central Water Districts formed a joint powers agreement way back in 1995. What's really sort of pushed more pressure on this was the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act the state passed in 2014. And that essentially requires local agencies to manage their basins for sustainability. And it also gives us a lot more authorities and responsibilities to manage the basin. And if we don't do it, the state will come in and do it for us. So we're not real interested in that. In March, we formed our local, what's called a Groundwater Sustainability Agency, the Santa Cruz Midcounty Groundwater Agency, often referred to as the MGA. And that's a joint powers authority that includes the County of Santa Cruz, the City of Santa Cruz, Soquel Creek Water District, and Central Water District. So we have a governing board that represents all 4 of those agencies, and we also have 3 members of private well representatives on that governing board. Under the Act, we have to have a groundwater sustainability plan prepared and submitted to the state by January of 2020. Which really means we have to have our draft done about a year from now, so to allow for enough review and consideration before we finalize it and submit it to the state. So we've got a lot of work to do in the next year. We've been at it for about a year. We've got another year to go. And once we submit that plan, we have to achieve sustainability by 2040. So we have 20 years to get the basin in good shape, and then keep it in shape for another 50 years, all as directed by by the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, which we frequently refer to as SGMA. So we did form the agency in March of 2016. And we decided that to develop this plan, it would be good to have an advisory committee that consisted of various representatives of different interests within the basin. So the Groundwater Sustainability Plan Advisory Committee, the first meeting was in October of last year, and that group has been meeting monthly ever since, working through this. And John Kennedy is going to talk a little bit more about what the committee has been doing and how the committee works. Again, here's another picture of the basin, some of the different agencies. The three water agencies are the City of Santa Cruz, Soquel Water District, and Central Water District. The county sort of has the rest of the area, so that's why all 4 of those agencies are there. The county doesn't actually supply water, but we do oversee the small water systems and the private pumpers. The geology of this basin is complex. Here's what it looks like from the surface, and then this is what it looks like if you sliced it and looked at it from the coast. So it's not really a bathtub at all. It's layers of rocks, some of which hold more water than other layers. All these little black lines in here are different wells coming down into the various layers of the basin. So it is a complex basin geologically. The water moves through it in sort of unpredictable ways. So we're developing a groundwater model. It's a mathematical, computerized model that really tells us how the basin works, to try to understand how this complex geology works. Some examples of some of the issues. This is 2014 or 2012, and this shows groundwater levels. Capitola is right here. Soquel Creek comes down and out here, Pleasure Point, Soquel Point. The groundwater level was below sea level. This is sea level right here. So in 2012, we had this big depression in the middle of the basin. which is not a good thing because it promotes the seawater moving back into the basin. And if it gets to those wells, they become unusable. So not what we want to see. The good news is things have gotten better since then. That was some of the worst situations. The other thing that we've been able to do since we started working on the basin is reduce the pumping. We're no longer pumping so much water from the basin, and that's helped those groundwater levels to recover. So that indicates to us, that makes us optimistic that the basin can respond well to management efforts. But reducing pumping is not going to get us all the way there. We're going to have to do some other things, develop some supplemental water supply projects to finish recovering the basin back to where it needs to be. This shows how the groundwater levels have fluctuated over the years. These are some actual well information. This SC9, these wells are near the coast. You can see fluctuation dropping down in 1993, 92, 93, 94 was the time when the groundwater levels were really the lowest. We had a period coming out of a drought period, this yellow, and fairly significant pumping. And then they've sort of recovered, gone up and down a little bit. And then this is what's happened more recently. As we tightened up our management, reduced our pumping, even though we were in a drought period, the groundwater levels have come back up because the customers and the folks in the basin had done such a good job of saving water and reducing pumping. So the basin can respond to management. This is the groundwater levels in the inland parts of the basin based on monitoring of private wells. You can see the record doesn't go back nearly as far because we just started in about 2008 monitoring private wells. And some of them have fluctuated. They fluctuate annually. This is the drought, and this is the big rains of 2017 came back up. Other wells didn't do as much fluctuation as that. So there's a lot of variability as to how the different wells respond in the basin. Seawater intrusion. The size of these dots indicate either actual intrusion or threats to intrusion. We've got salt water down here that we're picking up in these monitoring wells, and also out here at Soquel Point. We're also concerned that the salt water is very close to these wells here. So that's the concern there, but we already have salt water at these two locations, and salt water very close into the main part of the basin.
How deep are those monitoring wells?
Those monitoring wells they're completed at different depths depending to hit the different formations that we're pumping from. Some of them are 300 feet. I mean, they're completed at the different levels of the aquifers where we're pumping from, so that they can warn of any seawater intrusion. These are the monitoring wells, and then these are the production wells on the inlet. So couldn't tell you an exact number, but I could get that information for you.
Thank you.
So I'm going to turn this over to John. You're talking about sustainability.
All right. So how's this work?
That's bad. There you go.
There we go. All right. So I'm John Kennedy. I'm a private well owner on the board of the MGA, and I'm also one of the board representatives on the Groundwater Sustainability Advisory Committee. There are 5 members of the board who are on the planning committee, plus 9 other members who were solicited from the stakeholder public in the basin. We went through an application process, and there was a committee that selected folks to be on there, and we'll talk about that in a second. So John's talked about the state requirements that we have to become sustainable in this basin by 2040, and then we have to remain that way over a 50-year planning horizon. And the principal issues here, we'll talk in some very specifics about what the state requires us to consider, but the 3 big deals are groundwater levels, preventing any further seawater intrusion, and protecting groundwater-dependent ecosystems, stream flow, fish, all that kind of thing. here's what the state requires us to consider in terms of managing to be sustainable. I have to turn my head around because this is like the things you want to avoid, the negatives, as opposed to what you want to go for as the positives of sustainability. But we have to avoid these 6 undesirable impacts to sustainability. Reduce groundwater levels, reduce groundwater storage, the amount of water that's held in the aquifers, seawater intrusion, reduced stream flow, reduce water quality, and land subsidence. And as you probably know, out in the Central Valley, they have a serious amount of land subsidence, but we don't really have any sinking of 30, 50, 70 feet. There are these. You may have seen some of these old pictures from the 50s of a person standing next to a pole, and it shows the land used to be up there, 30 feet up above, and the person standing there. And there's some where that started again to happen, and in the last 20 years it began to happen again. So they've got some bridges somewhere. There's a picture like that where over 25 years it's dropped, 6 feet or 8 feet. We do not have, as far as we know, any significant land subsidence in Santa Cruz County, and certainly not in our basin anyway. However, we still are required by the state to address this possible indicator of failing to be sustainable. But the ones that are going to be important to us are these first 4 or 5. Reduce water quality, obviously, and a lot of these are related to each other. If you had seawater intrusion and had more salt water in your water, that would seriously impact water quality. If you don't have enough groundwater levels, that sort of immediately says you don't have enough groundwater storage either, right? So there's some things that are related here, but we do have to, as a committee, we have to make recommendations to the MGA board, who has to finalize the plan. And the staff's going to write the plan, but we have to look at policies which will impact our ability to make sure that we prevent any of these impacts from taking place. So let me just stop and ask, can you get your head around, it's the reverse. It's preventing the negative, which is becoming sustainable. Does that make sense?
Yes.
This is what the state's requirement is, just crystal clear about this, and we have to go through quite a bit of detail in each one of these in writing the plan and presenting it to the state for approval. They have to approve the final plan that we submit. We turn it in, but they may say that's not good enough. So it's not just that we create a plan, but we have to create a plan that they accept as meeting all their requirements. So in order to do the advisory aspects of the planning that we have to do over these couple of years that John was talking about, we've added these additional, besides the 5 representatives that we chose from the board, which was 1 from each member agency and 1 private well rep. We then decided to add additional representatives of different kind of stakeholder groups in the basin: agricultural use, business concerns, environmental concerns, institutional concerns, which would be camps or schools, basically, or the golf course. Municipal ratepayer, we have a representative of just a standard municipal ratepayer from one of the municipal water departments, whether that's, it could have been somebody from Santa Cruz Water Department or from SoCal Water or from Central Water, but just a ratepayer representative, a representative of small water system operator, somebody who's concerned with having to make it work as being a small water system. A small water system is a group which provides water to more than 4 houses. Has to be 5 to 200, correct? Right. So, and it's a state requirement, and it's overseen by the county. And these pre-existed, so they already exist. And anyone who's in a position to provide water to a larger group of houses. What happens with things like Seventh-day Adventists? Is that considered a small water system?
It is.
Yeah.
There are different categories of small water systems. There's community water systems that actually have homes and different connections. And then there's also transient non-community systems and non-transient non-community systems. We have these great definitions, but the Seventh-day Adventist would be a transient non-community system, because a lot of it depends. There's different standards for if people are dependent on that water year-round. That's a different standard than somebody that might drink it once or twice during the year, members of the public. So there are different categories of small water systems, but all of those are subject to oversight, first by the state, but then the state delegates authority to the county for all the systems that are less than 200 connections.
And is Cabrillo considered?
Cabrillo is a small water
So
system.
Cabrillo College is also, so we have several schools and camps and the Seascape Golf Course. And I'll show you those on a map in a minute where you can kind of identify them. Kathy, good question?
What state agency is in charge of the oversight of this?
Of the small water systems?
No, of what you're doing, what we're going for. Who's going
Department
to
of Water
evaluate?
Resources.
Actually, two state agencies. Department of Water Resources sort of develops the rules and the policies and the plan guidelines, and we work with DWR, but the enforcement agency on this is the State Water Resources Control Board. So if we fail to do what we need to do, we get turned over to the bad guys, the state water, well, I shouldn't say the bad guys, but they're the ones with the enforcement authority, and they're the ones that would come in and take over the management of the basin if we didn't act. And they basically have said all they would do is limit pumping and charge everybody a fee. That's how they would manage the basin.
I'm just going to quickly go through them, and I mentioned all these others, and then we have 3 at-large representatives. We were just trying to, again, expand to get a wider range of different viewpoints to give input to the policy decisions that the advisory committee has to grapple with to make their recommendations to the board, the MGA board, who then has to do the final approval of this official sustainability plan. Here's another map. You've seen a lot of maps, but here's the boundary of our basin. You can see the 3 municipal districts, Santa Cruz, SoCal Water, and Central here, and you can see their boundaries very clearly here. And the thing I think is interesting to see here is you can see the main watersheds coming down Aptos Creek, and we don't really see Valencia Creek on here, do we?
No.
It goes off over here. And here we have Soquel Creek up to this would be Olive Springs, the bridge, you know, where the fire station is as you're going up out. And this boundary is actually Branciforte Creek, so there's actually another creek here. And that is our western boundary. And so you can see then the larger gray areas are the small water systems, and these dots, which because we've blown this up, they don't look quite like dots here, are some of the individual wells, the private wells. And they tend to be in these coastal valleys, you know, that go out through various creeks. You know, this is Cabrillo College, just so you get a sense of this is 41st Avenue here. You can see where this would be the Capitola Wharf, the Aptos cement ship would be right there. This is the highway here, so you can get some sense of, that's Cabrillo, this is Aptos High School right there, sort of right over our boundary, past our boundary. Trout Gulch water and pure water. This is Land of the Medicine Buddha, that's the Seventh-day Adventist camp. This is Kennelin up here. All of that is Kennelin?
No, they have a lot of land up.
Yeah, there's also some agricultural areas in here, but maybe that's not. And what are those up there, John?
Jarvis Mutual is up there at the top, and I think there might be Enchanted Valley, or it might be the Girl Scout camp further down.
Are you sure Branciforte Creek is the boundary there?
No, it's actually the
Here?
ridge to the west of Branciforte.
Oh.
Is the ridge between Branciforte and Carbonary Creek.
Yeah, because I'm between
Yeah,
Branciforte.
you're sort of right in that zone.
So you're still with us. And as I think, John, you said this is coming down to the yacht harbor, right? So
And I think Jarvis Mutual is in the Santa Margarita.
Jarvis is interesting because most of their service area is in the Midcounty Basin, but their well is in
It's in
Santa Margarita. So
yeah.
and of course, we moved Purissima Mutual into the Mid-County Basin, and they were in the Santa Margarita Basin. But with the input we got from you guys, we got you in the Mid-County Basin.
What about Glen Canyon?
Glen Canyon, it sort of runs almost right along the boundary. But the lower part of Glen Canyon would be in the Mid-County Basin, and the way upper part of Glen Canyon would be in the Santa Margarita Basin.
Okay, so I'm actually really confused.
Oh.
Because I'm at the map that was on your website. I'm like right on the border.
Okay.
And my
Well, I
neighbor-
can talk to you afterwards and try to figure out where exactly you are. Some people are going to be right on the border. The border there is interesting. It's sort of on the edge of the basin, and even though we had to draw a line through there, it's a little bit fuzzy.
Well, I'm sorry to interrupt this, but like, that's one of my questions is, what defines this basin versus that basin?
Yeah.
Just someone random line? or-
No, it was based on geology. There's actually a granite ridge, underground granitic ridge that kind of comes up along through here. It's actually fairly near the surface on the western part here. A lot of these wells are into granite, actually. So that granite ridge is in this area. Everything to this side is pretty much Purissima Formation is where the water is. And then everything to that side is into Santa Margarita, and the Wampico Formation is where the water comes from. So there's a geologic basis for that. But in that granite ridge, it's not a sharp ridge, it's a fairly broad ridge. So it's it is a sort of a fuzzy area.
That doesn't help.
I'm sure it doesn't, but I wouldn't worry too much about which basin you're in.
Well, I'm sorry again, because I have a lot of questions. It being in the fuzzy area, I feel that way oftentimes in my life.
Mm-hmm.
The same. There's a difference between what's going on in the Santa Margarita Basin in terms of time frame, as
Right.
opposed to Mid-County.
Yeah.
And what we should do is you and I should talk a little bit on the side after.
Yeah,
All right.
yeah, let's, because I need to get through this, and
Yeah,
then,
I'm sorry, right.
but there will be also a discussion area where you're talking about private wells, and we can talk about that too. So, the schedule, just so some sense, we've already been through our orientation and committee charter, and we've been now in our first 6 months of actual planning process, which is really developing the initial evaluation of these 6 indicators that I showed you, and starting to grapple with what the thresholds are. There's several different things we have to do with each of these indicators. I'll go into that in a little bit of detail. The second half of this year, we're going to be looking at more objectives and measures for those same 6 indicators, doing some risk analysis and looking at the initial ideas about possible supply projects, because we do project that we're still going to probably need an additional water supply over time in this basin. And then once we finish that next 6 months, then we have 6 months as the committee still to deal with what are our recommendations and what are the costs of the recommendations we're making and how we're going to propose funding for that. And all the way along, we've been looking for grants for this, of course. And we're in pretty good shape for getting some grants because we're at the early stages of this kind of planning process. And so DWR's paying quite a bit of attention to us, and happily so far, they're also seeming to be willing to look with benign interest at some funding possibilities for some of what we may have to do. Ron?
And John, do you think being designated as a critically overdrafted basin lends to that more attractive grant funding opportunity?
I'm sure it does, but there are 55 of those in the state?
22 and 517 basins. 22 of them critically overdrafted.
22.
And 517 basins.
Yeah, so we're one of 22, but we're early out of the gate, and we sort of have our act together, I think, and that's all positive, and so we are we have the possibility of a little bit of being a poster child for what DWR would like to see happen, and so they're interested in helping us, but as Ron points out, we are critically overdrafted as well. And then we're going to finish our process as an advisory committee and hand this off, hopefully by July of next year, to the board, who then has to review that entire plan and finalize it and approve it and submit it to the state. So I'm going to go back to those 6 things: reduce groundwater levels, groundwater storage, seawater. We have to go through what would be the statement for our basin of what would be an undesirable result for each of those, what would be a basic initial threshold, the lowest possible measure statement that we could have for each of those, and then what would be the range and what would be objectives which could be measured, and how would they be measured for each of these things in different, and they would each be measured in different ways. But I want to give you just a quick look into seawater intrusion as one possible kind of view of what is the committee trying to grapple with. So some of you probably heard about SkyTem and the helicopter that came and flew over, and this is the result, one of the charts of the results of the SkyTem flights. All these little gray lines were the helicopter flights along the edge of the water. The helicopter could not fly with the electrical equipment, could not fly over anything where there were residences or buildings. So here there was a place where they could fly in here, but everywhere else they had to fly along, out about approximately a mile offshore. And the one you're looking at here, there were many of these graphs that were created from their data. But what you can see here is that if it were blue and green, it's freshwater. As you get into yellow, it would be sort of brackish. Orange is more brackish. Red is a lot of salt water in the water below the surface. And in fact, here we're looking at below the surface of the ocean. Okay, so this particular map is 110 meters below mean sea level. So 340 feet deep from the surface of the water, with the helicopter flying and looking through the seawater and measuring how much salt or fresh water is in the water below the surface of the ocean. So it's pretty cool that this was very new technology, that we were able to take advantage of some serendipity and get an opportunity to get a view that we didn't have, and that most people don't get to have, through some new Danish technology of what the state of freshwater is. And you can see that even here where we have, as you know, John already talked about, we know we had seawater intrusion here and down here. You can see here that this is very clearly showing at that level, which is 340 feet below sea level, which is down around the level where maybe we would be pumping to gather our fresh water inland here in these production wells, and here are the test wells, what do I want to call them? Monitoring wells along the edge. You can see that even here, when you're down that low, this is brackish water, it's not fresh water. When you see some of these maps up higher, closer to the surface of the ocean floor, closer to the surface of the ocean floor, this area starts to turn green and a little bit blue. So we're doing better here, but you can see that we have salt water showing up down in the areas where we would need to pump from it, right at the coast. So we don't have any wiggle room, basically. But we have data like this with which to use, as well as the groundwater model, which we've been working on for 2 years, 2.5 years.
At least.
Which is going to give us a lot of data about how rainwater comes down and how it flows through our various aquifers and how pumping affects that. And then that's going to connect to some data about what takes place with the seawater wedge coming in from offshore. Becky?
In 2014, the Stanford researcher did similar work at the beach. How does her work correlate with this work?
Ron?
We've had two peer review, well, informal peer reviews or peer reviews by prestigious reviewers, and they confirmed that this is appropriate. The reason you don't see red going further out to the ocean, why wouldn't you see seawater further out, is because the deeper you get, the less trustworthy the signal is down deep. But we have onshore wells where you can see we did inlays into the inland down the southern part, and we have monitoring wells, and that data matches up. So there's kind of a calibration to the whole technique too that strongly suggests it's right on
Where's
target.
the edge of the land?
This is the land edge right here. You see this green?
Oh,
Right there is the land edge,
oh,
right here like this,
oh, okay.
and here, and that's Soquel Point. So here's the Capitola Wharf, for instance.
And somebody was up in a helicopter doing
Yeah.
some electronic,
Yeah.
digital weird stuff? to
Sent
try
a electric pulse down through the water and is able to read the resistivity of the
Which means what?
of the reaction. It's how, saltwater and freshwater have a different amount of resistivity when you send an electric pulse through it, and you're able to
I mean,
measure
The
that.
ocean is salty.
Right.
They're going through the ocean and measuring the water in the groundwater below the ocean surface, below the sea surface.
What it does is it almost is like a slice, and it's tuned to measure, at a given elevation. So there's actually a whole bunch of these at different levels. And if you look at the other ones where they're actually measuring the salt water, you can see the salt water.
land of the ocean?
Yes, this is 340 feet down below
This
the
is looking
surface.
below the ocean floor to see.
Not the
how
surface of the water, but the,
Right.
but the
It's looking at-
ground underneath.
Yeah, it's looking at what's
Earth
underneath
underneath
the ocean
ocean
floor,
floor.
which under natural conditions, we would expect that to be fresh water because the rain falls on the land, goes into the groundwater, and then the
Is there
groundwater
proof of
flows
this, or
out
it
into
sounds
the ocean.
theoretical, but is there proof?
That's what Ron said, that's been peer reviewed against some other
This
studies,
is the
and
science.
Yeah.
their science has been played out for a while in Denmark. They've been using this quite a bit in Denmark.
So I'm confused now. So you're saying that at below 300 feet, the normal steady state on the ocean floor is fresh water?
No, this
Close
is,
to the coast, we would see more fresh water than we do right now because the fresh water pushes out into the aquifers. Supposedly in the old days, and this is totally anecdotal, but the ships, there were like freshwater springs coming up, and they could fill up their water barrels in close to shore.
freshwater floats on top of salt
But
water.
here's a good
Like
example.
we're measuring, sorry to interrupt, you interrupted, he said fresh water floats on the surface of salt water, but the map, as I understood it explained, this has nothing to do with the surface. This has everything to do with
This is-
300 feet below the ocean.
This is measuring the groundwater, not the ocean water.
Right.
Right.
Measuring the content of the groundwater offshore. Up until now, we only knew whether or not there was any salt water at these monitoring wells. This is the first time we've been able to look at whether or not there's any fresh water down in the aquifer below the ocean.
So this is
Well, what
the
does that
first.
have to do with fresh water on the surface of the ocean?
Just leave that one out.
Okay, John,
You mentioned it.
Okay,
You've got 2 minutes.
So,
Yeah.
in a long time ago,
Wow.
there was so much fresh water coming out of the hills and coming down through these aquifers and going under the ocean that it burbled up through the salt water and floated on top of the salt water out in the bay, and people could stick a bucket down there and get fresh water.
If you believe it.
If you believe it.
The point is that fresh water comes down and holds the salt water out from coming onshore. There's a wedge, which we can't, I don't have a picture here to show that. I don't want to go into that much detail, but the fresh water is coming down a wedge, and the salt water is coming in, and there's a place where the pressures equalize and hold the salt water from coming any farther in and inundating and infecting the groundwater, the fresh groundwater that we need to pump from. And there's an interface, and so we're trying to look at where is the interface of fresh water with the salt water.
Okay, so I have a question. So this is the first time we've had this kind of
Yeah.
data? So we have no information about 20 years ago or 5 years ago?
The information we have from before is how much chlorine is in these monitoring wells.
Right.
We have historic levels of chlorine in the monitoring wells.
Chloride,
Chloride.
the other chloride.
Salt.
Salt, yeah.
Let me keep going, okay? Because we could, I'm going to use up too much time here. So, having,
Well, it's just, hold on. You're making the
We have
argument that
questions.
there's salt intrusion, but
But
you're
there's no
showing, and
evidence.
it's not being explained, and it's not showing what the state was beforehand, and it's, well, the freshwater floats on top, but
This is
it's
just- okay.
really 300
So
feet
let me
below the
point
ocean.
out what this slide is for.
Finished. This is the thing, it's a lot of talk, but there's no real explanation, and it's creating a lot of confusion here amongst those who aren't very familiar with it.
Okay, so in many of these meetings, we've talked about that there is some evidence of saltwater intrusion down in La Selva Beach and at Soquel Point. And that, as far as we know, there had not been any saltwater intrusion significantly in between those two places. We've given a lot of that data in the past, and that's not the presentation I'm trying to give today. But, so we know that we have the possibility of saltwater intrusion. What this is showing is we have a lot more data now about what's happening offshore as well as what's happening just onshore. So that's a lot more data, but the data is agreeing with our assumption that we already have salt water right at the shore level, especially down where we need to use the groundwater. Does that make any sense, what I just said?
And you're correct, it would be good to know what this looked like 5 years ago. Our plan is to come back 5 years from now and repeat this to see how this has changed. But
Right,
this
so
technology is relatively
So making
new.
assumptions on one piece of data is not a good idea.
Oh, there's more than one piece of data. This is one piece of data, but there's a lot of other pieces of data we're looking at. For instance, we do know what the trends are at these monitoring wells. We've been monitoring those for many years, and we've seen how the chloride has increased in those wells. And we know at what elevation that saltwater wedge is that's pushing into these wells. And it's very consistent with what we saw with the helicopter here. You can see the saltwater wedge pushing in, but then you've got the freshwater here pushing back out. But the saltwater here has moved in, and the saltwater here has moved in. This well right here is salty. Interestingly, this well was salty and has gotten less salty, the one adjacent to it. So things can fluctuate a little bit here. What we didn't know was what was going on in here. All these monitoring wells are fresh, but we didn't know how far offshore that fresh water. We kind of hoped that maybe it was fresh water out to about here, but it's not. What it's telling us is that the salt water has pushed in very close to the coastline at the levels that these wells are pumping from. So it's kind of has drawn that in. What we're hoping is because our groundwater levels have gone up in recent years, that maybe we've stabilized it right here, but we don't know that for sure yet.
How long did this data gathering take? Was it over days, a week?
1 day.
1 day.
1 day. What time of day was it? High tide or low tide?
Doesn't really matter what the tide is,
It
because
does
they're
matter.
they're measuring from high elevation down to the ocean floor and then down below the ocean
Well,
floor.
San Lorenzo River, when, it's low tide, there's less activity at the edge of, over by the beach boardwalk in terms of saltwater intrusion than if there's like high tide when like the ocean is pushing water into the river.
That affects the surface water, the water in the ocean, the salinity there, but this is measuring the salinity well below the floor of the ocean.
340 feet below mean sea level.
So, and that measurement, is it taking the column, is that showing an average, or is it taking a distinct point?
It's taking a point that's about 10 or 20 meters, and higher up they did it by 5-meter increments. So there are a whole bunch of these maps, starting at, sea level or 10 meters below sea level and going down in 10-meter increments. So,
And that's average?
no, this is just the one that's down there at that level.
Okay, so this is showing at 100 meters,
110 meters, yes.
110 meter depth.
Yes.
At that particular point.
That's right.
The salinity of the water that's there.
The resistivity of the water.
The what?
Resistivity, how much it resists current. And then we can map resistivity to salinity based on knowing that salt water resists more or less, I can't remember, than fresh water.
Okay, thank you. Now I understand what this map is now.
If I could, one thing that was important that here for us to know, I'm also on the committee, is we need to understand where that saltwater interface is. Now, we all know there's a saltwater interface. It's a big Pacific Ocean and there's freshwater inland, somewhere these things meet. And what we need to know is where, or we'd like to know precisely, but we can't, is where that interface is. What we know is saltwater over here, freshwater over here. With the monitoring wells, we get an idea, and with this, we get a better idea. Once we know what that interface is, you can control supposedly control the water level of the freshwater. By putting more freshwater in, you can keep it out. If you go lower, then the saltwater will stay. So our key is finding out where that interface is, and then controlling it by not letting it come inland.
So I need to get going. You got to.
Well, John, I was just saying, I understand the curiosity. You think it's worth mentioning what we see just to the south in Watsonville and Monterey regarding seawater intrusion? That may set some stage.
Yeah. So this is somewhat scary, but it's okay. It has not come inland. Down, what Ron is pointing out is down in the Pajaro area, the saltwater intrusion is 3 miles inland.
Whoa.
And has been for a long time. And down in Marina, it's 10 miles, 9 miles.
Valley, yeah, it's almost.
It's way inland. So we are in better shape, but we want to make sure that we do not lose our barrier that we have holding the seawater from intruding further. And this was all to give you an example of what the committee then has to try to deal with, starting in addressing preventing seawater intrusion. We have to then look at some policy decisions, the first one of which was, what's the preliminary statement of what would be a significant and unreasonable condition about seawater intrusion? And what we decided was what you see here. Seawater moving further than has been observed in the past 5 years would be an unreasonable condition. And Darcy, I don't know if you want to. No, she's over there.
No, we don't need to get.
I'm not going to give why we got into all that, but there was a fair amount of discussion to come to that statement. You know, we have to come to many policy decisions about how do we want to treat the unreasonable conditions that we want to avoid. And so with seawater, this is the first piece of it. The next piece will be what is the baseline threshold of seawater intrusion, which what we're basically starting with is that it would not be any further in than how we saw it in the last 5 years, in any time in the last 5 years. And then we will have to go to how are we going to measure that. We will have to, whereas with many of the other ones you can measure it in many different places and have, if 80% of them meet that standard, then that's considered not being seawater intrusion. In this case, we have to draw a line literally along that map that you saw and say there will not be any seawater intrusion measured at 250 parts per whatever beyond this line, and it has to be one measurement for the entire basin. So that just to give you a sense of some of the things that we have to go through times the 6 different indicators. Kathy.
Just for some historical perspective, the Soquel Creek Water District has been dealing since the late 90s. When was the integrated resource thing? That was the first time they tried to do a water model. So we need to understand for the people, because we know it's happening. We have better tools to measure it today than we used to.
Yeah.
And for example, about at least 4 or 5 of what are now monitoring wells at one point were production wells. And the decision was made that it was important to move the pumping inland to get away from those coastal zones, which are going to lend more to the saltwater intrusion. So there has been, for 20 years, I know that agencies here have been trying to move away from the coast. The last one was at Beltsville, that 12 years ago, there were 3 of us that were yelling at Santa Cruz City for taking water out of those wells. Now that's where their saltwater intrusion is now a monitoring well. So I really appreciate that we've got better tools now.
What Kathy's pointing out is we have had for a while protective elevations established, and Soquel Creek has had protective elevations established for the various monitoring wells in order to say, what does the groundwater level in each of those wells have to be to hold off any significant seawater intrusion. So we already have these, and we'll probably do a little revising of these as we go further into our plan. But there have been efforts to measure and monitor these, as she's saying, for quite some time. This is an example of what the helicopter looked like and how it was doing its thing, flying along doing that.
How far along are you on your preliminary statements, and are they published?
To the extent that they are, we are pretty. We have done 5 out of the 6, I believe.
Well,
But the only thing that we've done is the initial statement, and what we have to do is do an initial threshold. We haven't actually done those yet.
Is that stuff available to read?
Yes.
yes.
It's on the website.
To the extent that we've done it, it's on our website, in the minutes. And I think we've just made some efforts, I don't know that we've done it yet, to isolate the reports of those planning committee meetings separate so that they would be where you could get at them more easily.
And we're actually revamping the way that page, the web page looks, to make it easier to find all that information.
Yeah.
Thank you.
There's
But
also an audio recording of all of those meetings available on the website.
But as I said earlier on, besides just getting these unreasonable conditions stated officially, we then have to have these initial thresholds, and then we need to have how we're going to measure them and what the objective measurements will be, what the objectives would be, what the high and the low of those would be. There would be an acceptable range, and how that's going to be measured. And would that be, if you're measuring it in 10 locations, for instance, for groundwater levels, is it that 80% of those have to be within a certain range, or 90% of them have to be? We have to go through all those discussions as an advisory committee. And those are policy issues as opposed to technical issues, right? And we're relying on the staff to do the technical piece of telling us what we should be grappling with. I think that's it. So we meet on the 4th Wednesday of every month for 4 hours. You're welcome to come. There are, besides our regular large meetings, we anticipate that we will have small working groups, which are usually made up of experts in those areas or people who have intense interests in those areas. One of them obviously would be stream flow and groundwater interaction. Another one may be land use, with getting some of the county planning people involved, in some of the city, Capitola and Santa Cruz City folks as well. And we will probably have something to work on defining what basin impacts, what does that really mean, and how do we measure that? Because when we get around later on to what costs may be associated with whatever we have to do, obviously that's probably going to be related to basin impact.
And the next meeting of the committee is what is it, 2 weeks from today? Or a week from, 2 weeks from yesterday. And we're going to be talking about surface water, and we're going to be talking about water quality. So,
Where's the location?
we're at the Simpkins Center, Simpkins Swim Center, the meeting room there. And then in July, actually July 19th, it's going to be a joint meeting with the MGA board and the advisory committee to talk about the different sorts of projects that are under consideration right now to replenish and provide supplemental supply in the basin. So that's going to be an interesting discussion, sort of summarizing the whole range of projects that are under consideration and actually being pursued. And then as we go through, you know, what John's talking about is sort of the first iteration, and we go in and we do the groundwater modeling with these objectives in mind, and see, okay, well, what's it going to take to meet these objectives, to maintain the groundwater levels at the levels that we want to keep to prevent seawater intrusion, to prevent stream water depletion, and see what it's going to take to do that. So it's sort of an iterative process over the next year to refine these and get it dialed in more, and to get some confidence that we can actually meet these objectives over that 20-year period.
Once we've decided on those objectives, we then have to look at what plan do we want to put in the plan, what actions might need to be taken to be able to keep those objectives in those ranges that we've established. And at that point, we're going to be looking at possible projects, the most obvious of which are additional supply projects, which, you know, probably we would not be executing or taking as an agency, but our member agencies are already involved and are down the road of planning possibilities for that. And we will be just taking a look at those. And in fact, that's what this meeting in July is, a joint meeting to listen to some of those possible supply projects to see what is the state of that, from, particularly from Soquel Creek and from Santa Cruz Water District.
So this was, we've gone a little over on what we intended to be sort of our background overview before we go into the small working groups. We've got about 5 minutes to answer sort of any burning questions about this. We'll also be available offline if somebody really feels like they need to ask us something. But we do want to roll into the small groups, so there's time for discussions within those groups regarding the particular topics of projects, environmental impacts, and small well users, what they can expect from this process. Those are sort of the 3 main topics. Darcy's going to introduce it more and give us some more information. But before we do that, we can take some burning questions. Yes.
I just have a question about surface water stream flow. How does that relate to what you're doing here? In other words, some people have what do you call it, a permission to
Right.
pump from different streams or rivers, right?
Right.
And so is that what you would like control?
No, we're not so much doing that. This is groundwater management, and so what?
But it says stream flow.
Right, because the stream flow during the summer is dependent on groundwater. That's what feeds the streams, is the water that's coming out of the ground and into the streams.
Not the rain from the winter?
No, the rain from, well, it is ultimately rain in the winter, but that rain during the winter time soaks into the ground and into the aquifer. During the winter time, most of that flow is runoff. It's just running off the surface and into the streams, but that runoff stops usually, within a month after the rain. So the water that's still in the streams is what's slowly percolating through the whole watershed, through the groundwater and into the stream. So if you pump your groundwater levels down too low, like below the level of the stream, that stream may dry up because water's actually going from the stream into the groundwater basin and it's not being fed. So we're very interested in trying to understand and prevent impacts of over pumping on the stream flow.
How about then pulling some of the winter stream water out?
That's one of the possibilities.
Storing it somewhere,
Yeah,
or using it when you need water.
That's exactly one of the
Just go into the
possibilities.
ocean.
Yeah, and right now, the groundwater basin is one of our best storage places. We store, already naturally, we store that winter rain in the groundwater basin for slow release into the stream.
The Santa Cruz planning process seems to be, 3 years plus or minus behind the Soquel Creek Water District's planning process. Soquel feels that they're in a crisis.
We're going to do this really quick, because we want to focus on other things.
So my question is, what is the groundwater agency and committees, what are they doing, what can they do to speed up Santa Cruz to sync up with Soquel before the saline incursion happens?
Well, everybody is moving as fast as they can on these studies, because we know that we have issues. We don't have just these groundwater issues, but we also have water supply deficiencies that we need to get. So both the Soquel and Santa Cruz are working on addressing their supply deficiencies, and there's hope that a lot of that can help benefit the groundwater basin. But all this stuff takes time to do the necessary studies, to know that it's going to work, to know that there aren't going to be unexpected impacts to some of these projects. So it does take time, but we're all working and moving in the same direction. As we develop our groundwater plan and our implementation plan, we'll be looking at those projects to see how they can benefit the groundwater basin and then incorporating those into the plan. Yes?
I may have missed this at the very beginning because I was parking, but why is this basin considered, I'll put my three questions together, considered critically overdrafted as opposed to the Santa Margarita Basin, which is not critically overdrafted? Why is this one considered critically overdrafted? What does that mean? And does all of the continued development that can, like housing development that the county of Santa Cruz is now doing, because we don't have Gary Patton anymore to prevent it, is that having any effect?
This basin is designated as critically overdrafted, primarily I think because of that seawater intrusion threat. If the groundwater levels are down below sea level, the seawater could come in and make portions of the basin unusable. Santa Margarita doesn't have the coast. Their groundwater levels are 200 feet down below historical levels, so that it has been overdrafted, but they don't have the threat of seawater intrusion that would make things a lot worse. So that's sort of the difference. With regards to growth, as you might have noticed from that one chart I had, even though we've had increased development and increased numbers of connections, the pumping has gone down. The actual groundwater use has gone down because we've gotten much better and much more efficient at what we use. And some of that new development has actually helped to drive some of that reduced water use through the Water District's water demand offset program. Other questions? Becky?
I've heard many people say this area has a water storage problem more than a water supply problem. So, capturing those winter storm runoffs and storing it needs to also be addressed, as well as creating other projects for supply, like the Pure Water SoCal that SoCal Creek wants to do, where you would treat sewage water and inject that in the aquifer. So I want to hear some more about storage, and I also want to have a qualifier on water quality. Is the water quality going to be measured only by the chloride? But what about any possible contamination if SoCal Creek Water District injects treated sewage water and there's a malfunction and we get all kinds of pharmaceuticals in our groundwater? Well, that's a degraded water quality too. So how will water quality be defined?
We are looking at all aspects of water quality and looking at maintaining the basin at, so that there is no drop below drinking water standards for any constituent, not just chlorides or TDS, but nitrate. We're also looking at these other constituents for which there are no standards at this point, but we are looking at that as well. So we are concerned with all aspects of water quality, not just seawater intrusion. And we'll be talking about that more in a couple of weeks. Your other question was storage, and you're absolutely right. We do need more storage, whether that's groundwater storage, whether it's surface water storage. We kind of gave up on surface water storage a number of years ago. Those are what that is reservoirs like Loch Lomond. But we do have a lot of available groundwater storage in this basin and in the Santa Margarita Basin. So what we're looking at is either capturing, either the purified wastewater or winter flows from the rivers, capturing that and putting that into those basins for storage so it's available there for drought periods, and it's also available to recover these basins and fill their storage back up to what they used to be. Or we use that winter water for water supply during the wintertime in SoCal Water District. It's what's called in lieu recharge. Instead of putting it into the ground, you just leave it in the ground and use the San Lorenzo River water for water supply in Midcounty. So those are all projects that are under consideration, basically that will increase groundwater storage one way or another. But we will talk about that more July 19th, and I think we'll head into our small groups right now.
One more question.
Is it short?
Yes. Why is the state involved in our county's water supply when I go driving to Sacramento and I see all of these almond fields and new almond trees being planted and there seems to be no regard for water out there. Why
Actually,
why are they involved in
the
that?
state is involved in groundwater throughout the state. All the basins, including those in the Central Valley, have to meet these requirements. And the good news is we don't live in the Central Valley, we're here, and I'm glad I don't have to deal with that situation. So Darcy, you want to start on the small groups?
Sure, and I actually don't have very much to say. I'm just going to give you a chance to understand where you're going to be depending upon your interests. We have 3 discussion groups tonight. One of them is environmental, and that's going to be Sierra and I over in the corner. The other one is for private well owners and small water systems over here with Jim and Kurt. And then up here, we figured this would be the biggest group, and this is going to be water supply with John and too many people named John. Yeah, so if you want to talk about water supply, just stay where you are. If you want to talk private wells, grab a chair and move over to where Jim and Kurt are. And I think we've probably got it covered with the couch area over for environmental, but if we run out, you can bring a chair over here. We're actually not using the question cards for here because we're taking all live questions. But John wanted me to tell you that if you have burning issues, hold on, don't start making noise yet. If you have things that you want us to talk about at our next meeting, we have these question cards that I was handing out at the beginning. Fill this out if there's something that you want us to cover that we're not covering tonight, and we'll do it at our next meeting.
And once again, when's the next meeting?
We haven't scheduled it yet. We think it'll be either late fall or early winter, basically when Sierra gets back from maternity leave.
And when we have something new to share with you, we don't want to just have a meeting for meeting's sake. We could do a meeting sooner if we get a lot of response on these cards and say, guys, we really need to know more about this particular topic. But we don't want to just take up the time by repeating what we just did. So it kind of depends on what we hear from folks.
So one of the major concerns that a lot of people have is what does additional water supply mean? And people have different thoughts about the various possibilities there are going to be. And one question for the MGA is, what is our role in terms of developing or managing or overseeing whatever projects take place about additional water supply? And pretty much what we've come to is that we are not going to be creating those projects as an agency because we already have member agencies who are already involved in that and have been involved in it for quite some time, as Jerry was pointing out. And if we were to try to get in there and start from scratch, it would just take much longer, and we really don't have a whole lot of time, given that the seawater is where it is.
Or money.
And we don't, and we may have to come up with money one way or the other.
Well, yeah, but so one of the key things is the MGA is a joint powers agreement of agencies that already do projects.
Right.
So Central Water District does projects through Recharge. SoCal Water District, which is a much bigger district, does water project and have proposed water projects. So does the county and so does the city. So they're already doing projects. So the MGA is really just a joint powers agency to say, well, okay, if you do that project, that'll meet our goals, so go for it, right? You were going to do it anyway, and you're just going to help us. So instead of it being the other way around, where the MGA gets to tell SoCal or Central Water, thou shalt do this, which, well, one, it can't, because they're individual agencies that get to do what they want anyway. They get to say, if you do that project, that'll benefit the groundwater, great, then we're behind you now. Maybe we apply for grants and do things to try and raise money, but the MGA itself is not an agency that has the funding to do any of these projects that we're talking about. It barely has the funding to operate today.
What we hope we will have is the aegis to be able to ask for money from larger entities, and they might pay more attention to us because we are the official agency that's designated by the state. So
And we have the year of the DWR because we presented it.
So the additional supply is, when we've looked back at, in the old way we used to calculate what the sustainable yield of our basin was based on what the hydrologist's estimates, we are now going to move over to using the groundwater model where we really look at changes in the amount of water storage. And we're just getting to the point where some of that information is going to become available to us as a committee, where we can see what the groundwater model projects, and then we can make changes in running that groundwater model. One of the things, for instance, we've thought about doing is what would happen, and it's just a weird theoretical, turn off all the private pumping and run the groundwater model and see what does it look like. In other words, how much effect does the private pumping in the hills have on the overall fluctuation of the groundwater storage? And so that's something that we can do with having this massive groundwater model that's a mathematical model that's been worked on and what's the word I want, Ron? It's been calibrated already. So we're at the point really where we can begin to look at a number of things and tie that into, over time, how that might affect seawater intrusion as well.
So what is the inputs into the model?
Historical data. So we've got all these monitoring wells, all the data that we have from the last 30 years or something, right? So that's, and the geology and physics, right? So this is, I mean, I don't know if you know anything with models, but it's very complicated. But the idea is they know, oh, we've got granite here, we've got gravel here, we've got sand here. These are the aquifers, these are the hills.
So
and they make a model.
They divided the...
So if you take and reduce the pumping up above, up in the hills, for instance, there's some other parameters that need to be considered, I would think.
Yes.
For instance, a lot of the water down here that goes into the sewage system goes into the sea.
Yes.
A lot of the water that goes into septic tanks and what have you go back into the groundwater.
Correct.
So I don't know how you judge, how do you put those parameters into your model?
The model is very complicated. I mean, we have hydrocomplicated, but they do account for evaporation, for the recharge through septic, recharge through the agricultural, recharge through places like Nicene Marks. It has natural recharge, right? It rains, the water percolates, there's no asphalt. So they take literally the whole geology of our area into account. And they run it, and what they do is they say, okay, we have, let's pick the last 20 years. And now let's model out what would have happened in the next 10 years. And we know what happened in the next 10 years because it happened. We're going so we're still in the past. So what you do is you use part of the past data, and then you run the model on the next 10 years, which is still past to us, so you can see what the result was. You're like, the model predicted this would happen. Did it happen? No, then the model's wrong. And you keep calibrating it until the model predicts what happened, and when the model can predict what happened, you have some confidence that it can predict, with some degree of confidence, what will happen if we change things, or even if you don't change things. So then that's when you get to say, oh, what if we had no inland pumping? What if we had no rain? What if we had lots of rain? What if we had...
So the inputs are many different things. You have rainfall, you have temperature, because temperature affects how much moisture can actually get into the ground, right? In evapotranspiration, you have the geologic makeup in 800-foot squares. I think the model is set up in each 800-foot square of the whole area is given its own geologic makeup depending on what that ground is like and what aquifer is close to that area. So all that stuff has to come into play and get calibrated to the point where it actually can show us what's actually been taking place, and then we can do some prediction from there. So one of the things that it's showing is that so far, it seems what's interesting to me is that the amount of rainfall has a huge impact on this changing amount of change in storage, this change in the amount of water which is in the ground, comparatively perhaps to the amount of pumping. So all that stuff has to be looked at, right? And then what kind of different pumping are we going to have in the future? That would be population and technology changes and conservation. And if we have if we have new ways that we're going to capture runoff and put it back into the ground, and then we get to additional supply, which we pretty much know that in this area over time, if not right now, we're going to need a fairly significant additional supply. And so that's why it's important that we're having this meeting next month where we're going to hear in some detail what possible projects are in play and what the various agencies that are doing them are thinking about the various, because they all have more than one possibility that they're looking at. So we want to hear what those possibilities are and become more educated about what the impacts of that are. And then what we're charged with as an advisory committee is somehow looking at what the risks are associated with any of those additional supply projects. And obviously then you're going to get into ROI and all that as well. But also what effect might they have on all these sustainable indicators that we have. Seawater intrusion, stream flow, all of that stuff.
But again, the GSP, especially when we're about setting the policy. So we set the policy, as an example, John mentioned, that we feel the saltwater interface must not come in any farther than where it is today. And we know pretty close to where it is today, and we know where it's been historically.
It just did. In that 5 seconds.
It's still moving slower than you would imagine, but it's not moving that fast. But and we've said that, and we've set parameters to say within the next 30 years, this is where we feel comfortable. So then a project, I'll give you a hypothesis, a project that says, I'm going to go on the cliffs of Seascape, and I'm going to put a 1 million gallon a month well there because I want to build, the next skyscraper. That's probably going to bring in saltwater intrusion because you're going to pump so much water that you're going to force the saltwater interface in. So we would say, as our policy, that would not be something that would be desired. Now, we don't have the power to say no or yes. That still goes back to individual agencies like the Planning Commission and the county to say, no, you can't put that well in. But they would listen, hopefully, to our guidance as the MGA to say that the plan said we have to be sustainable. You do that, we won't be sustainable, therefore you can't do it. But again, we're there as an advisory policy committee, not, the GSP is just a temporary, 2 years.
We've been talking a lot. What we really want to do is hear what you guys think or what you have as questions. We may not be able to answer them all, but we're really interested to hear what are the issues that come up for you around these issues. Go ahead.
I have basically 2 issues, and the last one will result in a question. The 2 issues are what I call quintuple whammy and endgame is the second issue. Quintuple whammy, when you get saline incursion in a well, coastal well, it's effectively long-term poisoned, for practical purposes permanently. And what happens then is not just the loss of the well, but you have to find a water source to replace that well. And then you you have to find the money and the means and go through all the planning, maybe 6 years worth or something, to get that source up to speed. So you lose some time. Then you need to find a way to transport the new source of water to the neighborhood where that old well was. And then you found, by the way, that you've lost 6 years or whatever. And in that 6 years, you might have lost some more wells because, you get behind the 8 ball. So there's 5 cascading bad effects when you lose a coastal well. And they're talking about likely loss in, rough guess, 2 years. But what I was trying to get at earlier is it's a matter of degree, especially, along that line. It might be creeping slowly, but it's creeping. It's moving as we speak. And so the clock's ticking. So that gets me to the second topic, endgame. Well, basically, you can get water from conservation, from the sea, from the toilet, or wastewater, or from the streams, and also there you can do catchment. Water off your roofs into rain barrels. It turns out catchment, if you only do it once a year, just fill it in the winter and then try to use it for the whole year, very expensive. You have to have big tanks, but if you can use the catch 20 times in the year, with a very small bucket, then it becomes cost effective, but it's not much water. So catchment isn't as attractive a source as you might think. We're going for conservation, that's great. That leaves the other three basic approaches. And whether you do desal or whether you do wastewater recycling, you're still going to want to do river and stream water capture, because Santa Cruz only uses 7% of the water in the river, Santa Cruz, San Lorenzo River, leaving 93% that goes out to sea on the average. And if we only took 3 of that 93% and shipped it to this basin, the basin would be filled in about 3 years. So that's what the Loquifer, LOCHQUIFER, Loquifer program proposes to do. And there's other lesser programs that would use existing pipelines and facilities right today. Graham Hill Water Treatment Plant, the existing 1.4 million gallon a day pipeline across 41st Avenue, and start filling that aquifer by means of in-lieu, as John Ricker was saying, where the people in the Soquel Creek Water District, they would shut off their wells. The district would shut off its wells and consume city water, and deliver that to their customers. So the aquifer would fill up because it wouldn't have to compete with all these wells sucking it dry. Mother Nature delivers.
That's one of the things that's going to be talked about. So
you're going to want, whether you have an industrial solution like desal or like sewage recycling, you're still going to want stream water because it's huge and it costs about 1/14. It's a better deal by about 42 times. 42 times the cost-benefit ratio, better than some of the proposals like desal. So it's a no-brainer. And by the way, if you put in a desal plant or a sewage recycling plant, it might be abandoned because river water is so much cheaper. Like in Australia, they built 6 of them and they didn't use half of them. They just abandoned them because their stream water was cheaper. And we live in a rainforest, so we've got a lot of stream water. If we only widen 2 pipelines and put in a well and work as a joint powers thing to get the water rights to feed the whole thing so everybody wins, including the fish, by the way, at all levels of elevation. That's one thing that desal doesn't do, and sewage recycling doesn't do, because that's at sea level that those things are generated. And the fish live up to, Loch Lomond, it's 577-foot spillover. So if you're going to do river water transfer anyway, let's get on with it. Let's build that pipe, but it takes maybe a year and a half, 2 years to do all the study and voting and money and getting the grants and stuff and get the thing built. Right now it's 1.4 MGD, the potable intertie across 41st Avenue. It needs to be 6 MGD. So start today, because you're going to do it anyway, no matter how all this other stuff. It's valuable stuff. Research you do with the modern stuff, really valuable. You want to know what you're talking about. But in the end, you're going to want a 6 MGD intertie. And by the way, if you double the number, if you make it 12, if you jump from 3 to 6 or 6 to 12, the cost for that doubling is only about 20% more, because you still have to dig the trench, you still have the easements and stuff, and it's only a few inches wider pipe that you put in the hole. So the cost of bumping it up to 6 MGD from the present 1.4 is just not that big. It's about 12 million bucks for a whole system that can take water in both directions. When Santa Cruz needed it could go that way too in a drought. We could really work together. Same with the pipeline from Felton diversion up to Loch Lomond, where you can store winter water. They've not been using the lock.
So Jerry, I want to make sure we hear other people too. So what you said that this ends with a question.
The question, I just want to say this other pipeline. The lock has not been used because they've left it full because they are in fear of drought. If they give that drought job to the aquifers, which are overdrawn, they're basically empty, and they're much bigger than the lock. then the lock is free to be a big repository for winter water each winter, a big scoop. And then it can dispense water all year to all the water districts in the region, very cheaply. And so my question is, why don't we get going on widening the pipelines and putting in the well at Felton, well under the river, by the way, because then river water filters through 10 stories of river sediment before it reaches the well, and what you get out of the well is filtered water that we could put in the well. So those projects together cost $30 million. Why don't we go build them now? Because we know we're going to need them, regardless of what the research says in the models, and regardless of whether we recycle sewage. And so, are you willing to take that approach and appeal to, say, the Board of Supervisors? I mean, you might feel like you're an agent of limited authority, but if you guys who are doing the research go to the soups and say, we want to go over the heads of all these individual 8 different agencies, 64 different decision makers that, you know, are going, just looking, I'm only responsible to my constituency. We need to get together up at the high level, the soups and the city council.
Well, you know, the two of the soups are on the board.
Yeah,
so, I mean,
but it needs to be a soups agenda item to put those pipes in the next year and a half, 2 years, so the water can be there. I mean, it can actually be used before you lose the next well, coastal well. Otherwise, you miss the deadline. If you don't start today, you miss the deadline for losing the next well and getting the quintuple whammy, and maybe more whammies shortly thereafter. You know, you may think that you have this timeline luxury, but you're up against it right now. In my opinion. Okay, now I'll relax.
Thank you. Other folks?
I just am wondering, if we're in such a critical state, kind of leads in towards that one too, is why aren't we taking action to do quick answers now, so that we have that aquifer being filled? I mean, from some of the things that I've read and stuff like that, that some of this with the tests that are being done right now on the piping, on the system and stuff, if everything goes well, and it seems to be going well so far, we can be pumping water into the aquifer this winter.
Or leaving it.
Or leave it there. But, and again, if we want to pump more, all we have to do is enlarge the pipes. Okay? So with all of that, let's say it costs $10, $12 million. Okay? Right now, the sewage treatment project is 4 years off in the distance. It's going to be depending on grants, which are paid back after the fact, and they could fall apart with everything that's going on in DC now. You don't know if you're going to get the money next year or not. You know, it just, and I just don't understand why we're not working faster on taking care of the problems that we can do right away and get that water flowing. And then if you want to do the desal or the sewage plant, you know, have at it, work on it, get your grant money and stuff, get things in place for it. But we need
step one though is the making sure that it will work, which they are doing.
Right. And from what I understand, that it's the tests have come out fairly good.
Yeah, so that's a great question. Your frustration based on the sense of urgency. So I will say, we have done a lot. The customers have done a lot. We're down. We were projected to be using twice the amount of water we're using now. A while back, we were supposed to be using this much. Now we're using half that much. So conservation, you as customers, some of you are well owners, are down to about 50 gallons per day, and the state average around 120. So I would say we have done a lot there. That's kind of our insurance policy as we get projects. Now, I think Jerry's onto something. This is not, you know, I think we get blinded like we have a pet project or something. This may not be it may not be an or, this or that. It may be a combination of things, the way things play out. And river water transfer If you come to our meeting, the SoCal Creek Water District meeting in July, I think it's
The 19th.
19th, thank you. And then Santa Cruz in August, we'll be talking about the results that they've been doing at Virginia Tech. The same guy who did, what was the big lead scare, or not scare, but Flint.
Michigan.
Same guy who did the Flint thing. This is why we're taking our time. But the results are looking promising, and that'll be delivered. They've been analyzed through a rigorous process because we didn't want any hiccups or jeopardize any customers. So I encourage you to come to those meetings, and they're separate than the MGA. These are the districts in Santa Cruz feeding into that, and see what the results of that are for the river transfer. And so we are moving along, and it's a pilot. We have a MOU, a memorandum of understanding with the city of Santa Cruz, the district does, to do this pilot to see how that works. And so, we're working on it.
And if I may, that's part of what the MGA does, is it's bringing these agencies together so that they don't put the blinders on. Because in a vacuum, each of them is just, like you say, it's a board that does their own constituency. The MGA says, well, each of you come talk together as a group so we understand each other's problems, and we can say, oh wait, you have that problem, I think I have the solution for you, why don't we work together, right? So I think we are moving. Now, I know that things like this don't move like that, but I want to echo Ron's point that you want to be careful, because I'm sure, I wasn't there, thank God, but the people in Flint didn't think, let's poison our customers. That was not on their mind. They thought, if we switch to start pulling in that water over here, we will give our customers better water. Unfortunately, chemistry is what it is, and this reacted with that, and suddenly we've poisoned everybody, and we've destroyed, to this day, destroyed the system, right? So you want to be very conservative with these things when you're mixing chemistries, because it's delicate. And so
But they can do things in parallel. And by the way, they've been doing this for a long time. The desal project shipped the very same water. Under the desal project, SoCal was going to get river water, basically. Not desal water, because the west side of Santa Cruz would have gotten literally desal water, most of it. But it's blended at Grand Hill Water Treatment Plant. And so, but by and large, that chemistry problem should have been addressed in the days of desal.
It does, but every time you change source, you have to be very careful. So, but the point is, they are moving.
And Flint is only one of the examples. There's many examples in California. There's two of them behind.
Well, yeah, I think we have
another person from the same.
Yeah, I think, one of the points you bring up here is about source, new sources. First of all, I don't think the modeling is going to be complex. The geology is pretty simple. The geology is simple for California geology. You have the Parisma Formation, which dips 5 degrees consistently off the mountains. There's a little bit of granite underneath it, and you're not worried about the granite because you're dealing with Parisma Formation.
But you do have several layers within the Parisma Formation. So a clay layer, a sandy
Those are
layer.
aquitards. You have aquitards and aquifers in this.
Some confined, some unconfined.
Some unconfined, but the model's confined. The model
It
is
looks at
confined.
unconfined too. It combines the surface water with the groundwater.
Yeah, but you have a confined aquifer. You have a confined formation on the Parisma.
Right, but feeding the streams is unconfined.
Yeah, that's the only unconfined thing, but that's the thing what's coming out of the streams. So that shouldn't be anything in your model.
Well,
you should be able to input that in there without any problem.
It's a daily time step on the rainfall. So that's how you ask the dissertation.
So you really don't need to do this. The thing that I think the model has to deal with is that you have a drastic elevation change from very high elevation, steep relief terrain coming down to flat. You have impermeable area here, more impermeable area down on the flats than you do up there. Parisma is the best recharge aquifer in all of Santa Cruz Mountains. The recharge area is up in the mountains. That's where you want to capture the water. That's where you want to get it to percolate down into the aquifer. So we need to think how we're going to do that. Because it pours down rain, the percolation cannot keep up with the rainfall anywhere in this area because of our sort of tropical rain type of thing. But with climate change, that can dry up pretty fast almost. So the idea is, how do we capture those things? And there can be several different ways of doing that. One way can be just simply by gullies on certain people's property, capturing those things in those gullies, so it's the resident time within that gully is enough to let it percolate down.
Sure.
And I think you guys ought to look at that type of situation. There's a lot of places. I mean, I have 16 acres up off the Rider Ring Road, and there's, I don't know, half a dozen places that capture take place in those areas and get percolation going in. And so that's one thing. And the upper elevations are, you have you're recycling water there. Here, you're not recycling water on the flats. You can't do it. You have to send it out unless you start capturing the sewage. So my point on the source would be, we look at trying to capture, having higher residence time in the upper elevation where percolation is good into the aquifer.
Totally agree.
I think there's another variable too, though, that nobody seems to talk about, but the planning department and the board of supervisors are constantly changing the code, the building codes and the zones. This is a big thing going on right now, that they've got high-density growth planned all the way down Soquel Avenue from Aptos all the way to downtown Santa Cruz. So that's going to put a much higher demand, even though they have offsets and they don't use as much. You still put in 1,000 units, it's still going to use more water. I think it's time that the planning department and the board of supervisors stop playing games with these codes and zones, leave them where they are so that it gives us a chance to plan on what the usage is going to be before it gets out of hand and we can't recharge it fast enough. Because if they get away with what they've got planned, the water usage that we're doing now is child's play.
So one of the things that's in the Sigma law is a requirement that the planning departments work in concert with the MGAs and vice versa.
Good.
And we're hoping to, and we've started, John has already started that process to reach out to the planning departments and get them involved in small working groups where we can talk about, so they can understand what kind of resource do we have and what strains would be put on us with whatever projections of growth. You know that they have to inherit what they get from AMBAG, right?
Right. But the thing is that they can put a moratorium on the codes and the zones right now to stop this nonsense, because they just passed some the other day.
Right.
They're going to be able to bypass CEQA and all this stuff and not use the what's it called, multiple use, where it's all apartments for 7 stories, and stuff, and it's just like
all those kinds of things. We're hoping we will at least have detailed discussions with them so that both sides understand what some of those impacts could be, and if there are changes, what kind of time frame do we need to have where we're required to have these projections that go out 20 years.
And what's key, as Joe pointed out, is that we have to work in concert because, sure, I mean, let's just give you a completely worse scenario. Yeah, they say, fine, put that well in, pump 1 million gallons. I don't care because I'm the county, I don't care. But they would, if that would happen and we would be out of compliance, then automatically the State Department of Water would come in and say, great, stop pumping right now. Everybody stop pumping because you're over your limit. So they would suffer consequences as well as the rest of us, right? It's not like they get to be exempt because they're somehow, because the state would be coming in and the state will always trump them. So they are also aware of this. That's why we have the county representatives on the board as well, right? The point is to work together and not an adversarial. And I do hear what you're saying.
Yeah, but it's just the fact that we're in this dangerous situation, and if the overdraft is so severe, it needs to stop now. They need to stop playing these games with the codes and the zones. That still allows them to build to the codes and zones that we have now.
The graph for you, but the good news is we've done a lot through conservation, as Ron pointed out. We are pumping now. Literally, our water usage today is at 1980 levels?
Late 70s.
Late 70s, early 80s.
Right.
We are pumping today at easily, twice, 3 times the population that we were back then. At those levels. That is what we're pulling out of the ground.
Right, but the ground doesn't have any more water.
What?
The ground doesn't have any more water.
The ground is recovering. The ground is recovering, and the saltwater intrusion is not, I mean, inches, yes, feet, no. We have reports back from 1986 that the saltwater is roughly where it was then, today, at those wells that we see. So, is saltwater intrusion a danger? Absolutely. It can come in. If we pump, and we've seen that, Pleasure Point, right? You pump a lot, saltwater comes in. You stop pumping, it goes back out. This is good. We know it responds. So we can make it respond to us. But Which I'm not saying, hey, pump away and who cares about salt water. I'm not saying that. But I'm saying we have to be aware of how fast that thing is moving and how it reacts to us. So, which is why either Soquel stopped pumping, I can't remember which ones they were, the ones that were way out there in Romus that you guys had to.
Where seawater
Yeah.
is most, we try to shift our pumping to less than
Exactly.
seawater.
So one of the things that all the agencies can do is say, oh, stop pumping on the coast, move in, right? Again, because we know we're learning over the years, right, where it's better to pump, where, sorry, you pointed out, the water's coming in from the mountains, so the far down. It'd be great if we could go pump way up there, but that's not practical. But that's what we were learning, how to manage it. So we are, I mean, at least in my opinion, and this is me speaking for myself, in as dire, like the sky is falling right now. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do what we're doing. It doesn't mean that we don't have work ahead of us. But we, as a community, as Roman and I, have done a lot. We've done way more than anybody else in the state to conserve and make the situation better. Now, possibly because we are more aware of the fact that we're a disconnected water system. San Jose over pumps, they're like, hey, Palo Alto, can I borrow some? Right? And then eventually they make it to Hitchhichi. They don't care. They're like, whatever, I'll just keep borrowing from my neighbor. We can't do that. We're isolated. We got nobody to borrow from.
I think Marco's right, but I do want to share a story with you. I think it's important. Remember when we went in that drought, everybody cut back like 25% from already low levels. So thumbs up, and that's really kind of helped us take a breath, and water levels rose. However, we had a gentleman come in about 3 weeks ago, and he sat down and he goes, my well's gotten hit over the last year and a half, 2 years. And now I had to just he gets served by us, and he has 10 acres that he receives money for a farmer to farm that money. I think it's around $22,000 a year he gets for 10 acres. He came to us and goes, I don't know what to do. I just had to give that money back to the farmer because the water, the chloride, the seawater in that well has just made the well unusable. So I say that because until you see somebody sit down and tell you that, it twisted my whole crew, my whole team, and when we saw somebody go, this is impacting me here, now, and has over the last year. It's real, and you can see the farmers down south. You're right, but it's a different story if you're that gentleman who's in that seat, or somebody like that.
So mainly the saltwater intrusion problem is from coastal well pumping and close-in coastal well pumping. It isn't the high elevation ones that are.
The model's going to indicate that one could say water flows down, so wherever you take it, there's less going out.
You have a head in there, but you also have percolation and permeability to consider on that as well, because the residence time within the aquifer might be a year or so down the way. The other thing is like a straw. Sea level, if you just let everything go where it is, and there was saltwater intrusion and no fresh water coming in, the saltwater intrusion just go to where sea level is. That's it. And you start sucking like on the saw, you then reduce the gradient and you start getting salt water coming up. The big impacts all the way along Monterey Bay, and especially into Salinas Valley, because you have saltwater intrusion all the way up into Salinas Valley. And that's from the coastal wells. And what they did is they went deeper and deeper and deeper, and now they're having problems in the deeper aquifers, and that's mainly because of the canyon. You're sucking it out of the canyon. You're not sucking it from the seafloor, you're sucking it from the canyon. That's what you're doing.
Was there somebody else who had a question that didn't get a chance to ask something or had a comment? Ralph, I thought you pointed to somebody earlier.
Okay. I'm just here to listen.
We got the heads up, we've got about a minute left, so I don't know that we can come to any conclusion here, but people talking about time, talking about how much growth, and talking about coordination with other groups and agencies as opposed to being stuck in silos, talking about how much can the MGA put leverage on any of those levers we were just talking about, money, time, coordination, and also capture of water. One thing I would say is anybody that's got a reasonable sized piece of property up in the hills, who is it that the people that have a grant to actually work with that and create swales? Resource conservation.
Resource Conservation District has done a lot of work with UCSC to identify the best locations for recharge throughout the county. There's a lot of work on what you're talking about.
And I think they told us that if they're private residents up in the hills that have a place that would be a decent place where they could put in something, they're interested in talking to you and would fund it, have some funding to put something that together. They're looking for those kinds of.
Yeah, I have several places, and I know the geology of the Santa Cruz Mountain well.
Yeah.
I've mapped it on offshore as well.
Right.
So I know where the best places are.
Yeah.
Well, if you're interested in doing it on your property, you should talk to them.
So it's the, what do you
It's the
call it?
Resource Conservation District.
Resource
How do
conservation.
they get them through you, or how should he get more information?
The easiest way is just go on Google and type Resource Conservation District, Santa Cruz County, and take you right there.
They have funding for that, to actually put projects in.
I have some ideas.
Cool. The main thing they have problems with is having a big enough place where the water actually could be held and, where it would work. So if you have that kind of land where there's room for it, scalable, they're really interested.
Well, it also improving the ecology.
Absolutely. There's some really wonderful stuff about international swale. The project they did in Rajasthan where 5 rivers came back that have been totally, and they just did it with local villagers creating capture things during the monsoon. It's amazing. Okay, folks, thanks for being here, and we'll try to capture this and take it back.
Thanks, John.
Thank you.
Small water systems and private well users have expressed, and hear what other issues or concerns come up. There are a few, Jim is going to kind of transcribe as we talk what some of the concerns are, so. There are a few things that have come up from past discussions, so what I'd like to do is kind of mention those first and get those on the list, and then hear what other concerns have come up that people have. Let's see. Is there going to be any charge for private well owners?
Rowdy group.
Oh, good, thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
I didn't know those things existed.
Are private well owners going to be metered?
This little pamphlet kind of explains it a little bit.
These are rhetorical questions.
Can there be credits for water recapture? There have been a lot of questions about septic systems and how much recharge comes back to the aquifer from those. There's fear about the impact of new wells in an already impacted area, or a gold rush to drill new wells. Question here, have any recharge areas been identified for construction and development in Soquel Creek Water District?
I know the county has been looking for sites, and they're down, okay, there's a,
Seascape.
there's one that the county has finally identified as a groundwater recharge site. One of the 5 or so.
Well, we've done, we've done some projects already. We've got a project at Polo Grounds Park. We have one at Romer Park where we capture the runoff water, filter it, and then put it in pits and goes down into the groundwater basin. We're now looking at the 38th Avenue detention site where all the water is already collected and then released out to the ocean.
That's 38th and Bromer?
Yeah, 38th and Bromer, which is picks up a lot of that water, so there's a lot of water available. And we've done some preliminary investigations there. It looks pretty good. So we're going to be doing more little more work to define that better to make sure it's feasible and then potentially go with a project. But there's also been work mapping additional suitability, additional recharge areas. The problem is the Mid-County area has challenges for recharge. A lot of the soils, the terrace, particularly the marine terraces where it's nice and flat, have clay soils. A lot of it is clay soil, so the water doesn't percolate in very readily. We actually have to drill down through that clay and get into more permeable material, and then we can inject the water through seepage pits. And there are some other sandy areas that UCSC has helped map that we're going to be looking at other potential sites as well.
And Soquel Creek has identified at least one, the golf course.
Yeah, the golf course area, it's down sort of in the Aromas and the Parissima F, which is a more sandy unit. Again, there's sort of some clay surface soils, but underneath that, it's more sandy.
And then there's one other question that I think is interesting. Have any areas been identified for injection wells?
What's an injection?
If you were recharging the aquifer by bringing water in from elsewhere and trying to just place it right back into the aquifer, that would be an injection well.
Were you looking for an answer to that, or?
At this point, we're trying to get questions.
Oh, get the question.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm not supposed to answer these.
That's right, John.
A 10-second answer
Keep us
would be
guessing.
good.
Don't be so rowdy.
Are there other questions or concerns that any of you have that you don't feel will come into the discussion? Becky?
Will private well owners be required to put meters on their well and report data to local authorities regularly, or the state?
That's kind of, there is an answer to that.
That is categorically no for de minimis users. Metering will not be required.
And do you want to explain what de minimis?
Well, excuse me, can we start with the first question first?
We're trying to see if there are other different questions.
Right,
that
so
come
we
up.
started to answer the second question, but, with no other questions, can we just start to answer the first question first?
Oh, sure. Will there be any charges for private well owners? Don't know yet. So I don't have an answer that says yes or no. It's probably not unreasonable to expect that as part of the process of keeping the aquifers full, there may be a charge.
Well, I might add that if the MGA board doesn't submit their plan and it isn't accepted, and the state steps in, they will put meters on the wells and they will charge for the pumping out.
They don't put meters on de minimis wells, but they will charge de minimis wells.
What's de minimis?
De minimis is a domestic well that uses less than 2 acre feet. So it is not per year. So we figure that's, a well that's up to 4 connections, 4 houses on a well would be considered a de minimis well.
1,800 gallons a day is 2 acre feet a year.
It's written up in this little pamphlet
Yeah.
here that you have.
Yeah.
That's on the desk over there. Yeah, it's on the desk over there.
So I think even at the state, if the state were to intervene, they would not put meters on.
They would not put meters on. The Act exempts de minimis wells from a metering requirement. So we don't have the authority to meter those wells under the Act. But we potentially would estimate water use.
Nick, did you have a question?
Well, I have a further comment on the fees. Up at Santa Margarita groundwater, I'm on the board up there.
Oh.
And what I'm promoting up there is to have no fees. And I'm hoping to get Mid-County on the same wavelength as what we are, so we don't have a split group where they start fees in Mid-County and we have no fees in Santa Margarita. Because, to make it short, most of us are on 1 acre or larger. Most of us provide a lot more water into the ground than we use because of the land surface that we have. There are some deviations from that, but for the most part. we do provide a lot more water than we use just because of the size of the land. And therefore, I think we should be getting credits the way solar people get credits to PG&E when they put up solar panels. We already provide the land, we're providing water into the surface, so we're an asset, not a detriment. We have a straw in the ground, but we have a larger, bigger well going into the ground, and that's our land, surface land. So I'm trying to hold a hard line saying that we're an asset, not a detriment. We don't own the condos, we're not paving over our land, preventing the water from percolating in the ground. So let's hopefully get on the same wavelength where we're pushing for a credit, which means hopefully we'll end up where we don't pay any fees at all.
So there will be a discussion of fees that will come up in our advisory committee and yours when you have them. And so I would encourage you all to attend those advisory committee meetings and follow that discussion.
And how will we be notified by the meeting?
Go to the website or sign up
Sign up
tonight
there
so
with
you
your
get
email address and you'll be able to.
So you'll be on our list of emails.
So I have a question. If we are charged fees, who gets that money and what do they do with it?
Yeah, good
And how's that
question.
preventing further, like,
How does that help the water?
how does that help the water? Exactly.
Well, and that's the whole thing. I mean, any kind of fee, if a fee was charged, this basin has already established sort of a policy that any fees would be based on impact to the basin. So if the small users have no impact on the basin, they wouldn't be subject to any fee, unless maybe a slight management fee. But there wouldn't be, but the other way the fees go, I mean, you have to do a whole engineer's report that justifies the fees, that shows what the costs would be and then how those costs should be allocated based on any impact to the basin or any benefit derived from those projects. But all that money would go to the Mid-County Groundwater Agency to pay for the implementation of the plan. It doesn't go anywhere else.
Okay, so Becky's question was, how does that help us with water?
Well, that's where we look at our plan. Our plan is going to have projects or programs to benefit the basin. And there's a cost of implementing those plans and those programs. But those might be more managed recharge projects. It might be bringing in the winter flow from the San Lorenzo River and treating that so it can be useful. It could be any number of projects. And first we define the projects. We look at who benefits, who's impacting the basin, and then we would go through the process of allocating any costs according to that formula. But we're probably almost a year from that part of it, or 9 months to a year from where we would be doing that. We're not going to really talk about fees until we have a lot more information.
Did you have a question? Question,
Yeah, two parts, but just to stay in the order here, I mean, I think it's a very interesting proposal. Why isn't the starting point no fees on the wells? And I forget the acronyms, whether it's MGA, SGA, whatever this entity is that you guys are all a part of, John, et cetera, the starting point should be this notion that there's not going to be a fee on the well. Why shouldn't we start there?
Well, you got to pay for things somehow.
But that's my point, is let's find out the other places to pay instead of having the private well owners.
Who's going to pay for
And
my
so
new pump on my well?
I'm just putting that out there. Help me understand what the discussion was to say, oh, we're okay to charge private well owners.
So there has been no discussion. No, there's been no discussion. It's simply that the act allows for charging a fee.
Correct, and the proposal that was
Administrative
made was
fees.
to say in this other district, and I don't know your name, but you proposed that take a hard line, no charges for private well owners. Seems to make sense to
Well,
me.
we got a couple of other things in play here. We have Prop 26, we have Prop 218, and those say that everybody has to pay their fair share, that one group of users can't pay for another group of users. So if the private well owners are deriving some benefit from this, then under those provisions, they need to be paying their proportional share of that benefit. Again, we don't have the information yet to say whether there's a significant benefit or a significant impact. Pajaro Valley, our neighbor to the south, everybody down there pays a fee for based on the amount of water that they pump. they have a very different situation where their groundwater levels are below sea level all the way back to the hills. So it's pretty easy to say anybody pumping from that basin is lowering that groundwater level throughout the whole basin. That's harder to say in a place like this where our private well owners are up in the hills and groundwater levels are many hundreds of feet above sea level. So again, we're not trying to prejudge it, but we do know we know we're going to have to deal with this down the road, but we need to have more information. For instance, this is one that Becky likes. When we run the groundwater model, we're actually going to turn off all the inland pumping, the private pumping, and see if that changes anything. It's not that we're planning on forcing you guys all to abandon your wells. We just want to use a model to measure what that impact might be, and if there really is an impact with no private pumping. In that case, there really is no impact with private pumping. So those are the sorts of things that we need to do to get more information to be able to address that question.
But if I understand your answer, John, was if you're a user, you're going to pay.
No.
No. There's no decision to pay, anybody has to pay anything.
Depends on how much. Did you read
That's just
that?
a discussion that in the future, there will be a discussion about whether there should be a charge.
If you
There is
benefit
no
from the
decision to
project or
charge.
if you're causing an adverse impact that needs to be addressed through the plan, then you would pay. But if you're really having no impact either way.
And your point being is that if you're a de minimis user, you might not be having an impact, and then you wouldn't be covered. Okay.
As Mr. Bullock said, and if you have a septic system, you'll be charging all the water that you've withdrawn from the aquifer. So I think all the things that he mentioned will be in that discussion that happens.
Let me just explain real quickly what my concern was. Mid-County is about a year and a half ahead of Santa Margarita. And I came here tonight specifically to try and get on the fee structure Santa Margarita ahead by a year and a half. And be in conjunction with Mid-County so we're on the same page at the fee structure. And that we're not lagging a year and a half behind Mid-County, because Mid-County may determine that a fee is going to be charged and will be behind the 8 ball. So I'm trying to get Santa Margarita up to speed with Mid-County on just the fee structure alone. So we have an established dual basin fee structure or no fee structure for the private well owners. That's my sole purpose for being here tonight.
Thank you.
Elaine.
Well, I have a question about being in the Mid-County groundwater deal, because I'm on the border in Glen Canyon Road, and I think it's a political decision as to that I'm here or I'm there. Is that true?
It was a hydrologic decision. We had to draw the line somewhere.
But do you know?
But
You know where all the aquifers are under the ground and so forth?
we have a good sense.
I'm 2 miles
And
down
as
from
I was
Mount
saying
Herman Road.
before,
I'm really Scotts Valley.
You're in a fuzzy area that very well may have no impact on either basin. So, but we're still working on
Okay,
that.
leave me out of both then.
Well, we may do that, but for the purposes of
I'm okay with that too.
the purposes of this program, we had to draw a boundary between the two basins, and we actually tried to make the Santa Margarita Basin smaller, and the state said, oh no, you have to pick up these other areas, and they actually put more areas into the Santa Margarita Basin than we really wanted to have in the basin, and probably those are areas that really shouldn't have been in there, but the state kind of did that to us. But as we develop our plan, there's a concept called management areas where you can divide the basin up into different areas, and some areas of the basin really may have no effect on other parts of the basin. The critical areas are along the coast and up the stream.
I know, that's why I feel like
and up the stream. So those people, there may be a management area where you are, where we really don't do anything because there's nothing to be done. And if there's nothing to be done, there's nothing to be paid for, right?
Yeah, I was wondering about, I mean, if there is fees in the future, what about springs and artesian wells?
You mean if that's your water source
Yes.
as opposed to a well? Well, they're considered groundwater.
Yes.
So.
But they're naturally. So is it pumping?
You're not pumping.
If you're not pumping.
Right. I'm not sure the act of pumping is defined as the issue. The issue is whether your water's coming from the ground or from some other source. But again, you know, these are considerations that the planning, the sustainability plan needs to take into account. And that's really the point, is that this sustainability plan needs to get as much input about different issues. Whether it's septic recharge or, you know, there are large parts of the basin that are defined by the county as groundwater recharge areas, and lot size is a minimum of 10 acres, as opposed to an area that isn't defined where lot size can be 1 acre or 2 acres. So, you know, that person that's in a groundwater recharge area obviously is contributing to the recharge of the aquifer, whether they want to or not.
Wherever you are in the basin and however you get your water, you benefit from having the basin being sustainable. So, I mean, that's kind of that's the starting point, I think, in my mind. You know, we want it to be sustainable, and all the other stuff kind of comes later or next or something.
Well, like we have it's a 28-acre parcel in the Rodeo Gulch Valley, and so it's providing a lot of recharge.
But if your spring goes dry, you're completely
sandstone as well.
Oh, good percolation.
So it's good percolation.
Yeah. And those are things that the committee needs to take into account as they're developing the plan. So, Becky?
So something that's been bothering me is really what Jim just said. If the aquifer is healthy, then everybody who depends on it for their water benefits. So if Soquel Creek wants to use their Pure Water SoCal project, and I understand that the Midcounty Groundwater Agency will not recommend projects. Their job is just to come up with the plan and what the picture of sustainability is going to look like, and it's up to the agencies to come up with their own projects to achieve those. And maybe that's not correct, but that's what I've understood. Then following that line, if Soquel Creek wants to put in their $135 million sewage treatment injection into the aquifer, then what you just said, Jim, then we technically would all benefit, and technically we would all have to help pay for that.
Or we would reap the benefit of them doing it without paying for it.
Well, or
that's just another
maybe the contamination consequence. That's my worry. But the cost, you know, this is a very expensive project. There are other projects that don't cost as much and could be started right away, and I don't see them looking at those with the gusto that they're looking at the dollars for a grant to achieve this injected sewage water.
So I think at this date, that's a question for Soquel Creek. That's not an MGA issue today.
But what this has just been said here, any project will benefit all of the users in the aquifer. So then if all of those who benefit have to pay for it, could conceivably the private well owners, the small water company users, be required to help put into this fee amount part that would help pay for this project?
Strictly hypothetical, I would say no, but that's just
and that project might not benefit, say, inland private well users. That project may benefit the groundwater levels in the coastal area, but it may have no impact at all further inland. So
that's kind of back to the zones that you mentioned.
So is that the model?
Pardon?
Aren't there wells from different aquifers?
Well, there's a number of different layers to the Carissima formation, and the potential injection wells would go into specific layers of that for either pure water SoCal or river water transfers, and they would be down in the coastal areas most likely.
But everyone has to remember that that's not a static water. The water is always moving towards
right.
like that,
right.
whether we inject or not.
Yeah. So will the model determine the sphere of benefit, if you will, for?
It will certainly help us do that. The model gives us certain things, and then we have to interpret that information, and we probably have to make some policy decisions based on what the model tells us. It's not, it has to be interpreted, and then ultimately the board has to adopt whatever those determinations are. But the model will certainly help, or at least we hope it will.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question. Do you know what the quantity in acre feet used in the basin is, like by all of the basin participants, an estimate of total water usage?
We do. I can't remember what it is right now. If we
Because
went back and looked at that plot that was on the PowerPoint, I think it's on the order of 15,000 acre feet right now.
Yeah, so one of the things that I've thought about, because some of you know, I run a 77 house water system in Aptos, and we use about 18 acre feet a year. And so if I think of 18 divided by 15,000, that's sort of like my percentage of what's being used. And so if I think about the magnitude of the cost of the projects that might happen, or the management, or whatever, and multiply that times my percentage, and then divide that by my 77 customers, when I look at those numbers, it's going to have to be a pretty darn expensive project or management before any of my customers are likely to even notice the fee that we're talking about. And you can, I don't have these exact numbers, I don't have anything to present, and we don't know what these projects might cost, but if you think about that, if your private well is using even 2 acre feet a year, which is, we said, up to the de minimis line or whatever, your average house is probably using a quarter or less. So think of that divided by 15,000, multiplied by, let's say, 150 million or whatever, and you're probably still talking $50 or something. You know what I mean? It's like, think about the real likely impact of these fees on you personally, and then it might help you gauge how significant it is.
I think you're making an assumption that these fees are going to be based on the percentage that you use. I wouldn't make that assumption at all. This government will come in and say, the fact that you have water at all, your level starts at, pick a number, and then it's incremental on top of that. That's the scary part we all have to be aware of.
We'll revolt.
That's what you have to think about, is that there's a fixed fee, just the way the city of Santa Cruz does. You have your line charge of $30, and then all utilities are that way, that's right. And so that's, I'll speak personally, that's the concern here. And when I hear that sort of argument that's just based on percentage, I get a little bit nervous, because these administrative entities are proven in the past to come up with a high fixed fee to gain all the money, and then the incremental part is based on the usage, which is just incremental.
Well, right now, all the users are paying for the management of the basin as it stands right now. The water districts are paying, the customers, the water districts are paying for it right now. The nebulous ones are the private well owners that are still out there waiting to see, how this goes down.
Yeah, that's us.
That's us. That's all of us, right? Exactly.
And that's, sorry.
As you see, the only example around here that I'm aware of is PVWMA. They charge, I think, 80 or 90. I think it's $80 a year for their management fee, which includes doing projects. So that's kind of speaks to what the numbers.
They have their management fee, and then they have a fee per acre foot pump that's on top of that.
So that's what you're talking about, $80 a year per well.
There's a management fee, and then there's an access fee, and there's a recovery fee, and they'll never forget your security.
There's a lot more of those fees when you're on a water system that has infrastructure to maintain versus a groundwater basin where you essentially own your infrastructure. So you can't really compare it to a water system that has to support that system no matter how much water is used. But I think, you've got a point. The management fees for groundwater management are typically low, and then they have a higher per acre foot fee to go along with that. Yeah. And we're kind of, these, Prop 218, Prop 26, kind of, we can't be arbitrary on how we do this. We have to tie any fees to the cost of what's being developed and to the benefit that's being received by the fee payer. So we do have some pretty significant obligations as an agency to properly define and set any fees. But again, it's very early to talk about what those might be. I mean, we're really going to be talking about it in the future when we have the information. Right now, we can all speculate on, oh, it might be like this, or it might be like this, or it might be like that. So we will be having discussions like this in the future that you guys are all certainly welcome to participate in, and we'll have a little more information to go, or a lot more information to go with the discussion.
Is there any distinction made between residential users versus commercial or recreational users of the water, the aquifer, or is it all considered the same?
It's not all considered the same. I mean, for instance, domestic users, residential users that are on septic systems, we factor into that most of that water that's used in the house is going back into the ground and most likely making its way back into the aquifer. Whereas, say, in agricultural use, most of that water is being applied to crops and being lost to evapotranspiration. So there's a lot more consumptive use. So we do take that into account in terms of looking at overall water use and impact on the basin.
I was just curious about, so for well permitting and well fee, for new fees for new development, would that be under, would those fees would be under that new, that would be something that would have to be addressed under the plan as well, right?
Yeah, I hadn't even thought about that, but there is potential. I mean, water agencies, water districts charge a higher fee for new development, sort of an impact fee, I guess, as you would. So, again, I don't know. That's something that would come out potentially in the future. It may still just be based on actual water use, because a lot of the impact fees for new development, again, on a water system, they have to pay for the infrastructure that already exists or that may have to be extended to serve that house, whereas a new house on a well, you're paying for the well, you're paying to drill that well and put in the tanks and all that other stuff. So there's not an infrastructure cost to the agency for new development.
Yeah, so that's what I meant,
Yeah.
because you're paying for the permits, you're paying for the well.
Yeah, I mean, right now the well permit, you're just paying for the cost and county oversight of the well.
I'd say we're on charges because it seems to me cost seems to be the most significant discussion. I do think, Becky raises a point about Soquel Creek's project, and I'm neutral on that personally, but I think the other considerations beyond cost are, water quality and those are the things that are important to well users, and that's going to be a real significant issue for us, that we have a comfort level that whatever's going back into the aquifer is going to be beneficial, or at least not.
Well, I want to know what everybody's putting in their septic tanks.
Yeah.
Well, right.
It's the same thing as putting in your body.
Yeah,
But that percolates through the surface soils, and they're talking about injecting it directly into the aquifer level at the same, virtually the same level.
They are?
Well, but it's also treated. Your septic tank is only doing very minimal treatment. I mean, I'm not arguing one way or the other, but I'm just saying, remember, it's not quite the same as injecting sewage.
Yeah.
It's treated.
It's treated, but they
drinking water.
can't get everything out.
I'm not saying that. I'm just saying it's not the same as saying we're in.
And neither do the septic systems.
No, certainly.
We pick up the constituents of concern in the San Jose River, in the groundwater basin, in La Selva, where they're all on septic tanks. Some of that stuff does make it through, whether it's through a sewage treatment plant or whether it's through the soil. So it is out there.
Same question about San Lorenzo River water.
Sure.
But it's not
flowing into that darn thing.
But that's not as concentrated as like sewage coming from hospitals and cancer treatment centers, things like that, That's my concern.
But it's also not treated as highly either, at least as it's currently being discussed, so that's.
But their consultants have already admitted they can't get everything out. Like nitrosamines, they can't get it out, and that's carcinogenic, even at low levels.
But a septic
I'm not
system
arguing,
doesn't try
I'm not
to get
arguing
anything
with you, I'm just
either.
saying, here's other considerations.
Yeah.
We talk about river water transfer, and that doesn't get the same level of of discussion as the Pure Water project in terms of what's in that water.
But some of those contaminants of concern are byproducts of the disinfection, like the nitrosamines. Those are byproducts of the disinfection process that are not processed.
And you get trihalomethanes in water from the river too. The city has a hard time, well, not a hard time, but they have to really work at meeting the standards in the river, treated river water for things like trihalomethanes. Again, the disinfection byproducts are a
Is it
product
safer to drink
of the
bottled
treatment
water?
process. No, bottled water is
Worse.
Worse. There's not as much oversight of bottled water. A lot of bottled water, they take it out of the tap and they run it through a carbon filter, and who knows what's in your bottled water. We do know that some of the bottled water has a fair amount of nitrate because it comes out of a spring draining the septic systems at Pasatiempo.
That's right, which is now being irrigated by recycled water.
I just had one comment. I think we also have to remember private property rights. We do have a right to the water under our well, under our property, without the intrusion of government. So as soon as you start having even a little feed, there's the intrusion of government coming in and taking a part of it, and that's the camel's nose under the tent. And very shortly after that, it's only going to go up. It's never going to come back down.
Exactly.
And like we held a hard line on meters 15, 20 years ago, got it down to the de minimis users, no meters. That was also a private property rights issue. And we held a hard line, and there are no meters. From the state level now. And we fought that here at the county level 15, 20 years ago. And we had a heck of a turnout and a lot of opposition to those meters. And that's why you don't see meters up there today.
Which leads us to our next question.
What is the story with meters? Someone said no meters.
De minimis users.
And that was my question to John, was going to be, it is de minimis users, but if you don't have a meter, how do you tell if you're de minimis?
I think that the assumption will be
I
made.
mean, call me stupid, but
No, I mean, the assumption will be made if
So
you're
if you have one house, but you have 17 greenhouses growing pot.
Oh, yeah.
You're using 100,000 gallons of water,
Yeah.
okay?
Okay, the de minimis user, to answer your question,
Talking
is
about my neighbor.
1 to 4 houses on one well that uses 2 acre-feet of water or less per year.
Right, but if you don't have a meter on the well, how do you know?
You wouldn't know. That's the way you want to keep it.
Right.
But agriculture, cannabis, whatever you want to do, they're supposed to have licenses and, all this. We can't get into that. If they get caught, they get caught, they're going to be charged a fee. What I think we need to do is hold it at the legitimate 1 to 4 houses on a well who are not in business, who just need it for domestic use only, and that those 4 houses don't use any more than 2 acre-feet. And then we're good for no meters, and I say we should be good for no fees.
I'm with you.
Keep in mind when we're talking about this too, we're talking about the state Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. That's a provision in that law from 2014.
We've got about 5 minutes left in this group, so just.
What about ADUs? If you have 4 houses on a well and a couple people want to build an ADU, is that adding another house?
No.
Is it? No.
Okay. Thank you.
That's good.
We treat ADUs like a bedroom addition or somebody planting a garden. I mean, people, once somebody has their well and their developed property, they can generally do what they want with it. Now, sometimes their neighbors aren't real happy with that. But again, somebody could use a lot more water by planting a garden than by building an ADU. So we kind of leave folks alone with that.
Okay, that's good.
I have a question for John. Have the Danish people invented something where they can tell where the aquifers are and how much water is in each aquifer? Because we talk about these aquifers, and really, I don't think there's any knowledge about where these aquifers are, how much water is in them, all that kind of stuff. It's just like,
Well, that's where we do the groundwater model, where we use the model to give us information on how the aquifer works. So that model is calibrated by wells. We need to have well information so we know how deep the well is, what kind of formations are underneath there, where the water levels are, how those water levels fluctuate. we put that all into the groundwater model, and it gives us an idea of how much storage
So
we
if
have.
you have all that information from a lot of wells that are in
Right.
a certain area, then you can
Right.
kind of guess about the
Yeah.
aquifer, but if you don't have that information.
Well, and that's one of the reasons we also encourage private well owners to come to the county and ask us to come out and measure the water level in your well. We provide that service for free to come out and measure where that water level is. If we do that over a couple different times, you get some idea of how the water level changes in that particular area.
Are you, on that same note, are you sending out little postcards to people like on Glen Canyon Road or whatever saying, we'll come out for free and look at your well?
I think that was in one of the postcards that we sent out already.
Was it?
Yeah,
Okay.
we've sent out a couple of postcards a couple different times for both Santa Margarita and for Mid-County, and that's one of
Like
the things.
everybody on the road kind of thing?
Everybody in the basin that
the
has a
basin?
well, we've tried to send a
And are they
postcard to.
responding? Are you getting?
We've gotten some response, yeah. Yeah, we had our guy out today who he was doing measurements in 5 different wells that people had called in and asked for that.
Thank you.
So, and it's on the website, there's a whole bunch of information on the website too.
Email us the answers?
Actually, we're going to aggregate all the questions from all the groups and put them with the answers.
And some of these we can't answer. These are questions that we're developing for the committee to answer. So there aren't necessarily answers to these. To be decided.
You have one right now? Do you want to get an answer to this? Well, so some of these are questions that don't have answers.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Most of
They're not answered yet by
Things we're
anybody.
wondering about still in development.